The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden planks of the cabin, carrying with it the bite of January cold that no amount of threadbare blankets could keep out. Elias sat hunched near the dying embers of the small fire, his fingers working methodically to repair a broken harness by the weak orange light. At 17, his hands already bore the calluses of a man twice his age, each ridge and rough patch a testament to years of labor that began before he could properly remember. The other occupants of the cabin, his mother Sarah, old Thomas, and the Williams family, had already surrendered to exhausted sleep, their breathing creating a rhythm of survival that Elias had known his entire life. He should have been asleep too. Tomorrow would bring another dawn of back-breaking work in the Whitford tobacco fields, another day of bowing his head and swallowing his thoughts, another day of being called boy, though he'd long since grown taller than most of the overseers. The knock came so softly that at first Elias thought he'd imagined it. 3 gentle taps against the warped door that barely hung on its rusted hinges. He froze, the leather strap falling from his hands. No one knocked on slave cabin doors at night. Overseers kicked them open. Patrollers broke them down. But no one knocked, certainly not with the kind of hesitant politeness that suggested the person on the other side was actually waiting for permission to enter. His mother stirred in her corner, her instincts sharp even in sleep. Elias rose slowly, every muscle tense with the possibility of danger. When he pulled the door open, the cold rushed in, and with it came something far more shocking than the winter air. Clara Whitford stood on the threshold, her pale face ghostly in the moonlight, wrapped in a heavy cloak that couldn't quite hide the trembling of her shoulders. But it was her smile that stopped his breath. Forced, fragile, like glass about to shatter, yet somehow desperate to appear genuine. Her dark eyes held something Elias had never seen directed at him before. Not pity, not contempt, but something that looked almost like supplication. "May I come in?" she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder toward the main house, which loomed like a white monument in the distance. "Please, I need to speak with you." Behind him, Elias heard his mother's sharp intake of breath. The other slaves were waking now, fear rippling through the cabin like a living thing. This was wrong on every level their world understood. A white woman, the master's wife no less, at a slave cabin after dark. The implications alone could get them all killed. "Mom," Elias managed, his throat tight. "You shouldn't—" "I know," Clara interrupted, and now he could see tears glistening on her cheeks. "I know I shouldn't be here. I know what it looks like, but I have nowhere else to turn, and you—" Her voice broke. "You need to know what's going to happen." Sarah was beside Elias now, her hand gripping his arm with desperate strength. "Mrs. Whitford, please," she said, her voice carrying all the practiced deference of someone who'd spent 40 years learning how to survive. "Whatever this is, it ain't safe for you or for us. Master Whitford, My husband is in town tonight," Clara said quickly. "At the card houses. He won't be back until morning. Please, give me 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, and I'll never put you at risk like this again." There was something in her desperation that moved past Elias's fear into a territory he'd never been allowed to explore. Curiosity. The kind that had always gotten him into trouble. The kind his mother had spent years trying to beat out of him for his own safety. Against every instinct for self-preservation, he stepped back and let her enter. Clara moved into the cabin like she was entering a foreign country, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, taking in the reality of how the people who grew her tobacco actually lived. Elias saw her swallow hard when she noticed the holes in the roof, the dirt floor, the single blanket shared by the Williams' 3 children. "I'll stand," she said when old Thomas, ever the diplomat, tried to offer her his stool. "This won't take long." She turned to face Elias and his mother directly, pulling her cloak tighter around herself. 3 days from now, my husband is meeting with a trader from Charleston. He's selling 12 slaves to cover his gambling debts. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Someone behind Elias began to pray softly. His mother's grip on his arm became painful. "Who?" Sarah whispered. "Which ones?" Clara's eyes filled with tears again. "I saw the list. Sarah, you're on it. Thomas, you and your son. The Williamses. All of you in this cabin except—" Her gaze locked onto Elias. "Except you. My husband thinks you're too valuable as a craftsman to sell, but everyone else—" The cabin erupted in barely suppressed panic. Mrs. Williams clutched her children, her silent tears more devastating than any scream. Old Thomas just closed his eyes, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been curse. Sarah swayed, and Elias had to steady her. "Why are you telling us this?" Elias heard himself ask, his voice harder than he'd ever dared use with a white person. "What difference does it make? We can't stop it. We can't run. They'd track us down and—" He couldn't finish. Everyone knew what happened to runaways. "I'm telling you because I'm going to help you," Clara said, and her voice gained a steel he hadn't expected. "I can't stop the sale. If I try, William will just do it anyway and probably beat me senseless for interfering in his business. But I can delay it. I can change who's on that list." "How?" Sarah asked, suspicion and hope warring in her voice. "My husband keeps the papers in his study. He's too drunk most nights to remember what he wrote. I can make it look like he changed his mind, put different names down. I can buy you time, maybe weeks, maybe months. Enough time to make plans to what?" Elias interrupted. "To run. Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't understand what you're asking. The patrollers, the dogs, the bounties. They'd hunt us down before we made it 10 miles, and when they brought us back—" He stopped, but the unsaid words hung heavy in the air. Clara stepped closer to him, and Elias instinctively stepped back. But she kept coming until they were separated by less than a foot, close enough that he could see the bruise on her jaw that her powder hadn't quite covered, close enough to see that her desperate smile was masking something much darker. "They beat you when you fail to meet your tobacco quotas, don't they?" she said softly. "They whip you when you dare to look an overseer in the eye. They sell your families away from you, separate mothers from children, husbands from wives. You live every day in a prison made of fear and violence." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "So do I." Elias stared at her, stunned by the parallel she was drawing. Behind him, he heard his mother's sharp intake of breath. "That's different," Sarah said carefully. "You're white. You're free." "Am I?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "I was sold too, Sarah. Maybe not on an auction block, but my father sold me to William Whitford when I was 17 in exchange for a profitable business partnership. I have no money of my own, no property, no rights. If I try to leave, the law sends me back. If I disobey, he beats me. If I fail to produce the sons he wants, he takes it out on my body and blames me for God's judgment." She paused, her eyes meeting Elias's again. "We are not the same. I know that. The color of my skin gives me privileges you'll never have. But we are both trapped in cages built by men like my husband." The silence that followed was profound. Elias felt something shift in his understanding, not a complete transformation, but a crack in the wall that had always separated them from us. This woman wasn't his friend. The power imbalance was too vast for that. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely his enemy either. "Why risk it?" he asked quietly. "Why risk your safety for people you barely know?" Clara's smile, when it came, was the first genuine one he'd seen from her. "Because I'm tired of being complicit in evil. Because every day I watch what my husband does to you and your mother and everyone on this plantation, and I do nothing, and that makes me just as guilty as he is. And because—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because if I don't do something, I'll forget I'm human at all." Over the next 3 days, Elias felt like he was living in 2 worlds simultaneously. By day, he worked in the plantation's workshop, repairing tools and equipment under the watchful eye of the overseer, Mr. Pierce. a man whose casual cruelty was exceeded only by his stupidity. By night, he met with Clara in secret. Brief, terrifying encounters where she passed him information about her husband's plans. She'd managed to alter the ledger, replacing Sarah's name with that of a field hand from the South Quarter whom William barely noticed. But it was a temporary fix at best. The trader was still coming, the sale would still happen. All she'd bought them was time. "There's a route," Clara told him on the third night, meeting him in the tool shed after midnight. "The Underground Railroad. I've heard whispers about it from the other plantation wives, though they speak of it like it's a disease. There's a Quaker family about 30 miles north, near the Virginia border. They help people like you, get to freedom." Elias felt his heart pound. Freedom. The word tasted strange in his mouth, like something from a foreign language he'd never been taught to speak. 30 miles, he repeated. Through woods patrolled by men with dogs and guns. "Ma'am, we'd never—" "You would if someone was driving you," Clara said. Her eyes were bright with a plan that terrified him. "William is going to Richmond next month for a political gathering. He'll be gone for a week. I could take the wagon, claim I'm visiting my sister in the next county. I could hide you and your mother under blankets and supplies. We could reach the Quaker house in one day if we left before dawn." Elias stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You'd be helping slaves escape. That's a crime. If they caught you. If they caught me, I'd say you forced me at knife point," Clara said bluntly. "I'm white. They'd believe me. You'd hang, but I'd be treated as a victim." The casual way she said it made his blood run cold. This was the reality they lived in. Even kindness from a white person came with the implicit threat of betrayal. "So why should I trust you?" Elias asked, his voice harder now. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate test, that you'll drive us halfway there and turn us in for the bounty?" Clara met his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When she handed it to him, he saw it was a page torn from her husband's ledger. The original page with his mother's name on the list of slaves to be sold, carefully hidden beneath the altered version. "This is proof of what I did," she said quietly. "If William discovers it's missing, he'll know I took it. If he questions me and I can't produce it, he'll beat the truth out of me, and I'll tell him everything. I'm putting my safety in your hands, just as much as you're putting yours in mine." She paused. "Trust has to start somewhere, Elias, even when it's terrifying." He took the paper with shaking hands, understanding the weight of what she'd just given him. It wasn't equality. It could never be that, but it was something. A gesture of vulnerability from someone who held all the power. "I need to talk to my mother," he said finally. Sarah's reaction was everything Elias expected and feared. "She's going to get us killed," his mother hissed when he told her about Clara's plan in the dark hours before dawn. "Or worse, she's going to get us sold so far south we'll never see daylight again. You can't trust white folks, Elias. Not even the ones who smile sweet and talk pretty." "I know that," Elias said. "But Mama, what choice do we have? You heard what she said. You're supposed to be on that sale list. Even if she bought us time, sooner or later Master Whitford is going to sell you anyway. His debts are only getting worse." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at the embers of their fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with grief and resignation. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent every night for the past week trying to figure out how to say goodbye to you? But running, sweet Jesus, boy, running is a death sentence. They'll catch us. They always catch us." "Not always," Elias said softly. "Bethany made it out 2 years ago. Jeremiah, too. We heard stories about them making it to Philadelphia. We also heard stories about Robert and his family being caught and brought back in chains." Sarah countered. "You saw what Master Whitford did to them. You saw—" Her voice broke. "I can't watch them do that to you, Elias. I'd rather be sold to Charleston than watch my son get whipped to death for trying to run. Elias took his mother's weathered hands in his own, and I'd rather die trying to be free than spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved you. The days that followed were torture. Elias went through the motions of his work, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly calculating distances, planning routes, imagining all the ways Clara's plan could fail. He watched her from afar during the day, saw her move through the plantation like a ghost in expensive dresses, always with that forced smile, always under the watchful eye of her husband. William Whitford was everything his wife had described, and worse. Elias had always kept his distance from the master, knowing that his survival depended on being useful but invisible. Now, watching the man interact with Clara, he saw the casual cruelty that permeated every gesture. The way William grabbed her arm too roughly when guiding her somewhere. The way he dismissed her words mid-sentence. The way his eyes followed the younger slave women with an intent that made Elias's stomach turn. One afternoon, Elias was repairing a saddle in the workshop when he heard raised voices from the main house. Through the open window, he could see into the parlor where William was pacing, waving a letter angrily while Clara stood with her head bowed. $17,000, William was shouting. $17,000 in gambling debts, and you have the audacity to question my business decisions? I wasn't questioning, Clara said softly. I was merely suggesting that perhaps we could sell some of the land instead of... The slap echoed across the yard. Elias froze, watching as Clara stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek. Several other slaves working nearby had stopped too, their heads carefully down, but their bodies tense with shared outrage they could never express. William grabbed Clara's shoulders, shaking her. This plantation is my inheritance, my legacy. I will not sell 1 acre of Whitford land because you're too sentimental about the slaves. They're property, Clara. Property. When you finally get that through your thick head, maybe you'll be worth the dowry your father paid me to take you. He stormed out, slamming the door hard enough that the windows rattled. In the parlor, Clara stood frozen for a moment before slowly sinking to her knees, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. Elias felt something crack inside him. It wasn't love. Love required the kind of equality that couldn't exist between them, but it was recognition, the understanding that different forms of captivity could sometimes look remarkably similar. That night, when Clara came to the shed, Elias saw that the bruise on her face had darkened to an ugly purple black. She tried to hide it behind her hair, but he saw anyway. "I'm moving up the timeline," she said without preamble. "William's leaving for Richmond in 3 days instead of next month. Something about an urgent political meeting. We need to go the night he leaves." "That's too soon," Elias protested. "We haven't—" "There is no more time," Clara interrupted, and her voice was sharp with desperation. "Tonight I heard him talking to Mr. Pierce about arranging the slave sale earlier than planned. He needs the money before he goes to Richmond, something about settling debts with important men. The trader is coming in 5 days, Elias. 5 days. We go when William leaves, or your mother gets sold." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elias's feet. 3 days. 3 days to prepare for a journey that could end in freedom or death, and no way to know which until it was too late to turn back. "How will we get past the patrollers on the road?" he asked, his mind racing through problems. "I have papers," Clara said, pulling documents from her cloak. "I forged travel passes for you and your mother. They say you're my personal servants, accompanying me to my sister's house. As long as we don't run into anyone who knows William's house slaves by sight, they should hold up." Elias took the papers, studying them in the dim light. They looked real, complete with official-looking stamps that Clara must have painstakingly copied. "You've thought of everything." "I've tried," she said quietly. "But Elias, I need you to understand something. Once we start this, there's no going back. If we're caught, when we're caught, most likely, I'm going to have to betray you. I'm going to have to claim you forced me, attacked me, threatened my life. It's the only way I'll survive." "I know," he said, though the words tasted like ash. "And even if we make it to the Quaker house, even if we get you on the Underground Railroad, you'll never be truly safe. Not in this country. They'll be looking for you for years, decades maybe. You'll have to change your name, hide who you are, always looking over your shoulder." "That's still better than being a slave," Elias said firmly. Clara nodded slowly. Then, in a gesture that shocked him, she reached out and took his hand. Her skin was soft against his calloused palm, warm despite the cold night air. It was the first time a white person had touched him without it being an act of violence or control. "When you're free," she said softly, "will you remember me? Not as the master's wife or as the white woman who could have been either your salvation or your doom, but as—" She paused, struggling. "As just Clara, someone who tried, even if she failed." Elias looked down at their joined hands, at the visible symbol of a barrier neither of them could truly cross. "I'll remember," he promised. "But I'll also remember that you had the power to walk away from this at any moment. That's something I never had." She flinched as if he'd struck her, but she didn't let go of his hand. "You're right, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for every day I lived in that house and did nothing. For every time I heard the whip crack and closed my windows instead of speaking up. For being complicit in 1,000 acts of cruelty just by existing in that world." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I can't undo any of it. All I can do is this one thing, this one act of resistance against a system I was born into and benefited from. It doesn't make me good. It doesn't absolve me. But maybe it makes me a little bit human." The night William Whitford left for Richmond, the plantation was quiet. Too quiet. Elias lay in his cabin, listening to his mother's rapid breathing beside him, both of them pretending to sleep while actually going over the plan for the 100th time. At precisely 2 a.m, they would slip out of the cabin and make their way to the barn, where Clara would have the wagon ready. She would hide them under blankets and sacks of grain, creating a false bottom to the wagon bed. They would travel north, avoiding the main roads when possible, using the forged papers if stopped by patrollers. If all went well, they would reach the Quaker house by nightfall. If all went well. Elias was just beginning to drift into an uneasy doze when he heard it. The sound of dogs barking in the distance and boots pounding across the yard. His eyes flew open as lamplight blazed outside the cabin. The door crashed open, and Mr. Pierce stood there with 3 other overseers, all armed. "Get up," he bellowed. "Master wants all slaves accounted for, now." Elias's heart stopped. William was supposed to be gone. He was supposed to be halfway to Richmond by now. What had gone wrong? They were herded out into the yard along with all the other slaves, shivering in the cold night air. Elias's eyes immediately went to the main house, where every window blazed with light, and there, on the front porch, stood William Whitford with Clara beside him. Even from a distance, Elias could see the new bruises on her face, the way she held her ribs as if they pained her. His blood ran cold. "Somebody want to tell me," William drawled, his voice carrying across the yard, "why my dear wife was caught sneaking into the barn at midnight with a wagon packed for travel." Dead silence. Elias felt his mother's hand find his in the darkness, squeezing tight enough to hurt. "No one?" William continued. "Well then, let me tell you what I think happened. I think my sentimental wife, who's always had too much sympathy for property that doesn't belong to her, was planning to help some of you escape." He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Elias had ever seen. "Now, I could beat the truth out of her, but that seems like a waste of time. So I'm going to make this simple. Whoever she was planning to help run, you have until I count to 10 to step forward. If you do, I'll only whip you. If you don't, and I find out later, I'll hang you." Elias felt the world narrow to a single point of decision. He could stay silent, let Clara take the blame, hope that William would believe her claims of acting alone. But one look at her face told him that wasn't going to happen. William was going to beat her until she broke, until she gave up names, and then they would all hang anyway. Or he could step forward now, take the whipping, claim he'd forced her, manipulated her, played on her sympathies. It wouldn't save him. They'd sell him south to a fate worse than death, but it might save his mother. It might save Clara from a beating that could kill her. 1. William began counting. Elias felt his feet start to move, but his mother's grip on his hand tightened to a vice. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't you dare." 2. "Mama, I have to." 3. "He'll kill you, baby. He'll kill you slow." 4. Elias looked toward the porch again and found Clara's eyes across the distance. She was shaking her head frantically, mouthing, "No, no, no." 5. "I forced her." The voice that rang out wasn't Elias's. It was old Thomas, stepping forward from the crowd, his weathered face calm with resignation. "I begged Mrs. Whitford to help me get to my daughter in Virginia. Told her my daughter was dying, that I had to see her one last time. She took pity on an old man. That's all." William's eyes narrowed. "Thomas, you're too old to run anywhere. Try again." "It was me," another voice called. Elias turned to see young Marcus, barely 15, raising his hand. "I was going to run. Mrs. Whitford caught me, said she'd help if I promised to stop stealing from the kitchen." "No, it was me," someone else said. And then another voice, and another. Within moments, half the slaves in the yard were claiming responsibility, creating a tapestry of contradictory stories that made the truth impossible to untangle. William's face turned purple with rage. "Silence, all of you, silence!" But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, each person claiming guilt to protect the others, to create confusion, to throw sand in the gears of William's cruel machinery of punishment. Elias felt tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by this collective act of resistance that he'd never imagined possible. On the porch, Clara was crying too, her hand pressed to her mouth as she watched the people she'd tried to help, now trying to save her in return. William pulled his pistol from his belt and fired it into the air. The crack of the shot silenced everyone instantly. "Fine," he snarled. "You want to play games? I'll sell the lot of you. Every single slave on this plantation goes to the auction block. See how you like that." "You'll do no such thing." Clara's voice cut through the night, surprisingly strong despite her battered state. She stepped forward, away from William, and addressed the crowd. "These people are trying to protect me because I failed them. I did plan to help someone escape. I planned to help Sarah and Elias. I forged travel papers. I packed the wagon. I did all of it, and they had nothing to do with it except be the victims of a system we've all perpetuated." "Clara, shut your mouth," William hissed, but she ignored him. "I did it because I'm tired of being complicit in slavery. I'm tired of watching human beings suffer and doing nothing. I'm tired of being a prisoner in a marriage that treats me like property while my husband treats other human beings the same way." She turned to face William directly. "You want to punish someone? Punish me. These people have done nothing wrong except exist in a world that considers them less than human. But I made a choice. I chose to act against the laws of this state and the rules of this household. So whatever consequences come from this, they should fall on me, alone." The silence that followed was absolute. Elias couldn't breathe. No one could. They'd just watched a white woman confess to helping slaves escape, knowing full well that she'd just condemned herself to a punishment that could include anything from a beating to being locked away in an asylum. A common fate for disobedient wives in the South. William moved so fast that no one had time to react. He grabbed Clara by the throat and dragged her toward the house. "You want to take responsibility," he snarled. "Fine. Let's see how much righteousness you have left after a few hours in the cellar." As he hauled her away, Clara caught Elias's eye one last time, and despite everything, the bruises, the terror, the certain punishment awaiting her, she smiled. That same fragile, desperate smile she'd worn when she first knocked on his cabin door. A smile that said, "I tried, I failed, but I tried. The cellar where William locked Clara had once been used for storing wine. Now it served as a more sinister purpose, a place where the master could discipline his wife away from prying eyes and judgment. The slaves all knew it existed. They heard the screams sometimes, muffled by thick walls but unmistakable in their anguish. For 3 days, Clara stayed in that cellar. William allowed her no food, only water. Elias learned this from Bessie, the house slave who was forced to carry down the water bucket each evening. "She don't cry no more," Bessie whispered to him when she came to the workshop to have a broken bucket handle repaired. "She just sits in the dark and stares at nothing. Master says she can come out when she learns to be an obedient wife." On the 4th day, Elias made a decision that would change everything. He waited until night, until he was sure William had retired to his study with his usual bottle of whiskey. Then he slipped into the main house through the kitchen entrance, moving with the same careful silence he'd learned from years of being invisible. The cellar door was locked, but Elias was good with locks. He'd had to be, living in a world where every tool, every scrap of food, every moment of privacy had to be stolen or improvised. The lock gave way after a few tense minutes, and he descended the narrow stairs into the darkness below. Clara was curled in the corner, wrapped in a thin blanket that did nothing against the cold seeping up from the earthen floor. She looked up when she heard him, and for a moment she didn't seem to recognize him. Then her eyes focused, and she gasped, "Elias, you can't be here. If William catches you—" "I brought you food," he interrupted, pulling out the cornbread and dried meat he'd saved from his own meager rations. "And this." He handed her his coat, knowing he'd freeze without it but unable to stand the sight of her shivering. Clara took the offerings with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "You shouldn't have come. You'll be punished too." "Maybe," Elias said, sitting down across from her in the darkness. "But you took a risk for us. Seems only fair to return the favor." They sat in silence for a while as Clara ate, the simple act of chewing seeming to require all her concentration. Finally, she spoke. "I ruined everything. The plan, the escape, all of it. I'm so sorry." "You didn't ruin anything," Elias said quietly. "You tried. That's more than most people in your position would ever do. But trying isn't enough, is it?" Clara's voice was bitter. "You're still enslaved. I'm still trapped. William is still in control. Nothing changed except now everyone knows I'm a failure and a traitor." "Something changed," Elias said, thinking of that moment in the yard when slave after slave had stepped forward to claim responsibility. "People saw what you tried to do. They saw someone with power choose to risk it for people without any. That matters. Maybe not in the way you wanted, but it matters." Clara wiped her eyes, looking at him with something like wonder. "How can you be kind to me after what I did? After I promised to help you and your mother escape and instead got you all into worse trouble?" "Because kindness is one of the few things they can't take from us," Elias replied. "They can chain our bodies, sell our families, beat us until we can't stand. But they can't make us cruel. They can't make us stop caring about each other. That's ours." In the darkness of that cellar, something passed between them. Not romantic love, which would have been impossible given the chasm of race and power between them, but something equally profound. Recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement that they were both human beings trying to survive in human circumstances, both prisoners of a system that dehumanized everyone it touched, oppressor and oppressed alike. "When William finally lets me out of here," Clara said softly, "he's going to send me away. To my father's house, probably, or to one of those asylums for nervous women. Somewhere I can't embarrass him anymore." "Maybe that's not the worst thing," Elias ventured. "At least you'd be away from him. And you'd still be here. You and your mother and everyone else who I promised to help but couldn't." She laughed bitterly. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing I had one chance to do something meaningful and I failed." "You didn't fail," Elias insisted. Failure would have been never trying at all. Failure would have been standing by and doing nothing while people suffered. You tried. You risked everything. That takes courage. Courage should accomplish something more than getting people hurt, Clara said. Sometimes courage is its own accomplishment, Elias replied. Sometimes just the act of standing up, even when you know you'll fall, even when you know you can't win. Sometimes that's enough to inspire others to try too. You showed me and my mother that not all white people are enemies. You showed the other slaves that some people in power can choose compassion over cruelty. And you showed yourself that you're more than what your husband and your society told you to be. Clara reached across the darkness and found his hand. Promise me something, Elias. Promise me that if you ever do get free, and I pray to God you do, you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember that somewhere in Virginia there was a woman who tried to help, who failed, who paid the price for that failure, but who never stopped believing that slavery was wrong. I promise, Elias said, squeezing her hand gently, and I promise I'll tell your story. Not as the master's wife, but as Clara, the woman who chose humanity over comfort, even when it cost her everything. They stayed there in the darkness, two people from different worlds who should never have met, but whose lives had become intertwined by circumstance and choice. Above them, they could hear William's heavy footsteps pacing in his study, the master of the house who controlled everything and understood nothing. Finally, Elias had to leave, slipping back out before dawn could expose him. As he climbed the cellar stairs, Clara called out softly, "Elias." He turned back. "Thank you for seeing me as human, for remembering me as Clara." "Thank you," he replied, "for trying to see us the same way." 2 weeks later, Clara was sent away, just as she'd predicted. Her father came with a doctor who declared her hysterical and in need of rest. Elias watched from the workshop as they loaded her into a carriage, her movements slow and stiff, her eyes hollow. She didn't look toward the slave quarters, didn't say goodbye. Maybe William had forbidden it, or maybe she simply couldn't bear to. The slave sale happened the next day. 23 people from the Whitford plantation were sold to pay William's debts. Elias's mother was among them, sent south to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in seasons, not years. Elias wasn't sold. True to William's earlier assessment, he was too valuable. Instead, he was given his mother's cabin and told to train a new generation of slaves in his carpentry skills. A privilege, they called it, a reward for his usefulness. At night, in the cabin that still smelled like his mother, Elias would hold the piece of paper Clara had given him, proof of her attempt to save them, and remember. He remembered the knock on his door that cold January night. He remembered Clara's desperate smile. He remembered their conversation in the darkness of the cellar, two prisoners from different worlds trying to understand each other across an unbridgeable divide. 5 years later, when the war came and the Union soldiers marched through Virginia, Elias walked away from the Whitford plantation a free man. He never learned what became of his mother. He never saw Clara again. But he kept his promises. He told her story. He remembered her not as the master's wife, but as Clara, the woman who'd tried to be human in an inhuman system, who'd failed but tried anyway, whose courage had planted a seed of hope in his heart that slavery couldn't kill. And sometimes, late at night, he would think about that moment in the cellar when their hands had touched in the darkness, two people recognizing each other's humanity despite everything that said they shouldn't. It hadn't been enough to save them. It hadn't broken their chains or changed the world. But it had been real. And sometimes, in a world built on lies, reality was the most revolutionary thing of all. Years later, after the war, after emancipation, after he'd built a new life in Philadelphia, with a wife and children who'd never known bondage, Elias would sometimes tell his grandchildren about the night a white woman knocked on his cabin door. He'd tell them about courage and failure, about the difference between being free and being truly liberated, about how change sometimes starts with one person doing the right thing even when they know it won't be enough. "Did she save you, Grandpa?" the children would ask. And Elias would pause, thinking of his mother sold away, of Clara sent to an asylum, of all the ways that courage had fallen short of victory. "No," he'd say finally. "But she reminded me that I was worth saving, and sometimes, when you're living in chains, that's the most dangerous gift anyone can give you, the memory of your own humanity. That memory can't free you by itself, but it can give you the strength to free yourself when the opportunity comes." The children would nod, not quite understanding but sensing the weight of the truth in their grandfather's words. And Elias would sit back, an old man now, a free man, a man who'd survived what was meant to break him, and he'd remember Clara's smile, that desperate, determined, fragile smile that had changed everything and nothing all at once. That smile had been a promise. Not that she could save him, but that she would try. And in trying, she'd proven what the system of slavery worked so hard to deny, that the space between oppressor and oppressed, between black and white, between slave and master, was not as vast as they'd been taught. That humanity existed on both sides of that divide, even when the system itself was designed to crush it. She'd failed to free him, but she'd succeeded in something perhaps more important. She'd reminded him he deserved to be free. And that memory, that dangerous, precious memory, had stayed with him through 5 more years of bondage, through the war, through his escape, through building a new life. Clara's knock on his cabin door hadn't opened a path to freedom, but it had opened a door in his mind, and sometimes that was where freedom had to start.